Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a virtual conversation about issues of critical importance both to America and to the world. And welcome as well to today's discussion on a very big issue, the future of U.S. foreign policy. I suppose it's arguable, but I'd make the argument that the current pandemic is probably the most consequential event since the Second World War. But unlike that war, the only one in American history that left the United States stronger at home with more influence and clout abroad, the pandemic may well leave the United States weaker at home, facing huge problems, galactic problems with respect to the challenge of national recovery. And after the last several years, a much diminished reputation with respect to American competence and credibility. Aside from these domestic challenges, we're going to confront a world that is going to be particularly harsh, continuing great power competition, particularly between the US and Russia and China, a series of intractable conflicts which have resisted the force of American diplomacy, and smaller powers, North Korea and Iran, determined seemingly to protect their own interests. And those are the conventional challenges. The unconventional ones pale by comparison. The reality of climate change and the pandemic, the issue of viral flu. 2/3 of the newly discovered pathogens in the world today are viruses. So I guess my question is, if it's unrealistic to expect America to transform the world, and yet it's undesirable to see America withdraw or extricate itself from it, what's the balance between transformation on one hand and extrication on the other? What does American leadership actually mean in this new environment? And who or what will we be leading? The old quip that a leader without followers is just somebody out for a walk, I think is actually quite relevant after the last several years. So what are our real priorities abroad? How do human rights, our value propositions, fit into the priority of what we do and how we relate to the rest of the world? Now, clearly, there'll be different answers to these questions depending on which way the political winds blow in Washington. And yet, I'd like to pose a basic premise for this discussion. Is there something still called an American national interest, tethered and driven by a determination to protect American prosperity, American security, a national interest which reflects to some degree our values, who we are and what we are? And can this national interest in a highly partisan climate gain the kind of traction to turn into a sustainable American policy to promote our interests abroad? Fortunately, I don't have to answer any of those questions today, but we have three extraordinary presenters who have agreed to try to tackle them. They're all known to you, and well, they should be. They combine a deep authority and expertise, thoughtful commentary on American foreign policy. In the public space, we have several practitioners with deep experience and authority of what it's like to actually advise and practice foreign policy within the government. Michèle Flournoy is the co-founder and managing partner of West Executive Advisors and a former co-founder and chief executive officer of the Center for a New American Security, where she currently serves on the board. Michèle served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from February 2009 to February 2012. Stephen M. Walt is the Robert and Renee Belfair Professor of International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, contributing editor at Foreign Policy magazine, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the author of numerous books and articles on international politics and U.S. foreign policy, including most recently, The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. Finally, Jake Sullivan is a non-resident senior fellow in Carnegie's Geoeconomics and Strategy program and the Magro Family Distinguished Fellow at Dartmouth. Jake served in the Obama administration as National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden and the Director of the Policy Planning Staff at the State Department, as well as Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. So without further ado, 5 minutes each, moderated round with me, and then we'll go to Q&A. And to those who are listening, we will have, I promise you, a live Q&A session where you can ask us questions. To do so, use the live chat feature in YouTube, email us at pressoffice@ceip.org, or tweet at us at Carnegie Endow using the hashtag Carnegie Connects. So, Michèle, I'll turn the virtual space in the year of the plague over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, David, and thanks for hosting this great discussion. I want to start with using my time to kind of frame the world that we're going to live in going forward, and the really daunting national security inheritance that the next president will face. As you mentioned, this is going to be an era of increasing multipolarity and a much more intensive competition between states. I hope we'll talk about the multidimensional competition with a rising China. It has economic elements, technological elements, ideological elements, and security elements. We see revisionist Russia under Vladimir Putin that's willing to use, the full KGB playbook to undermine our democracies, our alliances, and our interests around the world. And I think we see an emerging competition between a bloc of authoritarian states and the liberal democracies. So much more competitive. In addition, we have a growing set of transnational threats. Obviously, we're living through a pandemic. It's not going to be the last one. We have an existential threat coming from climate change, and we are not rising to meet that as yet. We have continued proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. We have global inequality and instability, which frankly, this virus has set us back a decade in terms of poverty reduction and so forth. And some of that inequality may result in points of instability and state failure. And we have, in many cases, systemic corruption and other threats to democracy and human rights and rule of law around the world. Plus, as you mentioned, David, there are the sort of perennial security threats that won't go away. Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and its support for terrorism in the Middle East, North Korea, terrorism, and so forth. At the same time, this is all happening in an era of profound technological disruption. The emergence of AI, quantum computing, new types of biotech, new threats in cyberspace and space. And so the next president's going to have to confront this very dynamic and complex environment at a time when we're also trying to reverse and recover from the damage that's been done in the last 4 years. The loss of U.S. global standing and credibility and leadership, the damage done to our most important alliance relationships, the unpredictability in the White House that's created huge uncertainty about what is U.S. policy? How does the U.S. define its interests? Can we rely on them as a partner and as a leader? And the decimation of critical instruments of U.S. power and influence, whether it's the State Department and our diplomatic corps, the intelligence community, USAID and our development assistance organizations, and just the ability that for the United States to be trusted as a voice of truth and facts and reliable information for the rest of the world. And of course, damage done to civil military relations. All of this repair work, this restoration, will have to be done at the same time that we're managing the longer term effects of the pandemic, trying to invest and accelerate our own economic recovery, and sharpening our technological edge to compete, addressing the systemic racism and inequality in our society, and really restoring the vibrancy and the civility and strength of our democracy, both for ourselves, as Americans, but also to try to reclaim some right to be a model for others in the world. So in this context, and I'll wrap up here, I think the U.S. and the role in the world has to be based on a much more refined and rethought sense of our interests and values, as you mentioned. And we'll be approaching this not from a position of primacy, but from one where we need to be a trusted and credible leader to build coalitions of like-minded states, especially other democracies, to address these shared challenges. When you go through that list, there's not a one that we alone can address successfully if we go about it in a unilateral manner. I think that reinvesting in our unrivaled network of alliances is a huge source of continued advantage for the United States. Those alliances need to be revitalized, in many cases refocused or repurposed, but they will be invaluable. And we need to rebalance our toolkit, reestablish the primacy of diplomacy and our economic influence, reinvest in those resources, and don't just reach for coercive measures like tariffs and the use of force. Be smarter about the use of force, more focused on deterrence and preventing conflict and reducing the risk of miscalculation. There's a difference between a strategy of engagement and leadership in the world and one of versus one of military overextension. So I hope we can get into some of those questions.
Michèle, thanks. That's that description of a cruel and merciless world, combined with the reality that foreign policy begins at home, really presents the next president with a set of galactic challenges. We're going to get back to the issue of priorities during the Q&A. Jake, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and it's great to be with Michèle and Steve, and to be with all of you watching this from home, wherever you are. I hope you're safe and healthy. I actually am going to pick up the issue of priorities, and I do so with some trepidation because when I was director of policy planning at the State Department, I'd frequently have to go out and give speeches about the priorities of the Obama-Biden administration, and I'd lay them out, and then all the hands in the audience would shoot up, and people would say, "But what about X, and what about Y, and what about Z?" And it was a reflection of the extent to which the United States is engaged on every significant issue and in every significant part of the world. So I'm going to offer a few thoughts on priorities, but also say I'm hereby incorporating by reference whatever issue it is that you care about, and saying, yes, that'll be part of the priority list too. So really, I want to focus on three touchstone priorities that I think have to lie at the foundation of U.S. foreign policy as we head through the next phase of the pandemic and then come out the other side. And the first is something that Michèle touched on towards the close of her remarks, which is really investing in our sources of strength and competitiveness here at home, and being much more focused on the way in which domestic policy and foreign policy cannot be neatly divided, and the extent to which national security threats and challenges are fundamentally implicated by the choices we make about our economy, our society, and our democracy. We're dealing with three overlapping crises right now: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a racial justice crisis. And we cannot be a strong and effective actor in the world if we are not a strong and just society and an inclusive economy and a vibrant democracy at home. And so I think making the kinds of investments in long-term inclusive economic growth, in overcoming the scourge of systemic racism after 400 years, and frankly, in creating more resilience in our systems so that some of the most profound challenges that we face going forward, another pandemic, global climate change, cyber threats, that we have throughout the entire United States a kind of depth, a reservoir of resilience that can help us withstand and remain strong in the face of those challenges. On this point, I would just add one other thing, which is Aaron asked, sort of, is there such a thing as the national interest? I do think that U.S. foreign policymakers have gotten a little bit too comfortable in just accepting long-term definitions of national interest, and that we need to make some adjustments to them. For example, in our national economic interest, I don't think equating the desire of multinational corporations to get access to markets elsewhere with the US national security interest will serve America's purposes going forward. Instead, we should be asking what is going to grow and sustain a strong middle class? What policies will do that? So I think a refinement of how we approach the national economic interest really matters. The second big area, which Michèle also touched on, is reinvesting in a meaningful way in our alliances. And I really fundamentally believe that they can be designed fit for purpose for the 21st century, with less emphasis on the military dimension and more emphasis on the diplomatic, economic, and values-based dimensions of those relationships. That's to deal with emerging challenges like strategic corruption or cyber or climate change. And it's also to deal with the great power competitors in Russia and China that we're going to face going forward. And I hope we can get more deeply into that discussion. I also think we should think beyond the pure treaty alliance structure that was built after the end of the Second World War and extended after the end of the Cold War to a broader set of like-minded states who share a similar view and vision for the kinds of cooperative arrangements and rules that really help not just the United States, but the world tackle what are a set of shared problems. And then finally, China. The rise of China is as consequential a geopolitical event as we've seen in the past decades. And the United States needs a strong, smart, steady approach to dealing with the rise of China, to managing that relationship effectively, to doing so in concert and consultation with allies and partners, and to try to achieve what a former colleague of Michèle and mine, Kirk Campbell and I, called in a foreign affairs piece, competition without catastrophe, that it will be a more deeply competitive relationship, but one in which we have to work to avoid a descent into all-out confrontation or even war. And also where we work together when it is in our interest to do so. So getting that relationship right, I believe, has to be at the top of the U.S. priority list as we go forward. So investing at home, investing in our alliances and relationships with like-minded partners, and dealing with a rising China in a clear-eyed and effective way, for me, among the many other things that we need to deal with, are where the hard thinking, the tough choices, and the strategy for the future has to begin. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Jake, my head is not exploding, but it's spinning with just an extraordinary and economic presentation from both of you, but with an agenda that is really quite extraordinary. And we're going to get back to this distinction between the world the way it is and the world the way we'd like it to be, to see how much of this is aspirational and perhaps how much can actually be achieved over time. So, Steve, I'm gonna leave the last virtual space of presentation to you.
Okay, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here with Jake and Michèle and you, Aaron. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the world we're headed into and what I think it means for the United States. COVID-19 is unquestionably a disaster, but if there is a silver lining, is that it provides us with an opportunity to rethink some of the ideas about the U.S. Role in the world that maybe haven't worked out especially well in the past, and be more selective and effective in how we engage with the world in the future. And let me make 5 quick points on this. I mean, first point I'd make is even before the pandemic hit, the world was becoming less open. There had been a broad backlash beginning against globalization, not just in the United States, but in lots of other places, whether you think of the financial crisis in 2008, the Brexit decision, the Trump and Sanders movements here in the United States. You remember that Hillary Clinton actually opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership when she ran for president in 2016. And our economy was, at least in part, beginning to decouple from China again before COVID-19. Similarly, you've seen around the world greater concerns about immigration, refugee flows, resurgence of nationalism in many countries. And I think the pandemic is accelerating both of these trends. We've now seen that complex supply chains are actually vulnerable to both political changes or a virus. Looking ahead, I think we're going to see bigger stockpiles, more diverse supply chain, more domestic production. even if it's less efficient and even if things cost more as a result. I think we're also going to, we've discovered that the free movements of people is something for which we were not fully prepared from a public health point of view. So you were seeing walls going up around the world. That was happening before the pandemic. Those walls are not going to come down to pre-COVID-19 levels, I think, anytime soon. So it's a world that's going to be a little bit less open. Second, the world is becoming less free. The Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations all believed that US-led globalization was going to create a more open, free, democratic world. And this assumption turned out to be wrong. China didn't liberalize as we had hoped. Russia certainly didn't liberalize. According to Freedom House, last year was the 14th consecutive year in which the level of freedom in the world actually declined. And the United States has actually been downgraded by The Economist from the category of a full democracy to the category of a flawed democracy. States like Poland, Hungary, Turkey, all veering in more authoritarian directions. Again, this was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic is likely to make this problem worse. In emergencies, even democracies tend to impose various restrictions on civil liberties. They concentrate power at home. You get censorship, surveillance, suppression of dissent, a greater role in the economy, et cetera, even lockdowns. We see all of these things happening all over the world now, and some of those measures aren't going to be rolled back in some countries, even after the pandemic is gone. So I think we're headed for a world that is going to be less open and less free. My third point, COVID has dealt, I think, a serious blow to the image of American competence, and both Michelle and Jake referred to that as well. States listen to us around the world when they think we know what we're doing, and we look a bit like serial blunderers right now. And I guess I want to emphasize that this problem is not just Donald Trump and the way he's handled the pandemic. The Iraq War, Afghanistan, Libya, the failed peace process in the Middle East, the financial crisis of 2008, all of these, I think, tarnished the American image that we really know what we're doing. Our inept response to the pandemic has, of course, made that worse. And getting that reputation back is not going to be easy. Fourth point, the pandemic is going to have lasting and serious economic consequences. We are piling up truly enormous levels of debt. COVID-19 is making the inequality problem worse in the United States and exposing the iniquities in our healthcare system. And as Jake emphasized, the Black Lives Matter movement is a reminder of how much work we have to do here at home. And by the way, don't forget about all that infrastructure that we complain about, but we never seem to be able to do much to fix. All of which brings me to my last point. The United States is going to have to be much more selective and smart in terms of its international engagements going forward. I think we were overextended before the pandemic, but in the future, Americans are going to care a lot more about jobs, about being able to send their kids to school, about being able to get health care, et cetera. Then they're going to care about which corrupt Afghan politician is currently ruling in Kabul. I think costly military programs are going to be a tougher sell when you have 200,000 plus Americans dead because we had inadequate public health measures here at home. So I'm not making the case for isolationism or radical disarmament. I'm just suggesting that trying to be the indispensable nation in every corner of the world is not going to be economically or politically feasible. So let me just make 5 quick points then on what we ought to do, sort of a sentence apiece. First, we ought to be cooperating with other countries to deal with the pandemic, first and foremost. Second, we should be cooperating with other countries to address the long-term threat from climate change. Until we have a reasonable response to this disease and until we address the long-term problems of climate change, we are not securing, I think, a future for ourselves in the short term or the longer term. Second, we should be gradually turning responsibility for European defense back to the Europeans so that the United States becomes the responder of last resort rather than the first responder. That should be a gradual cooperative process, but revitalizing those alliances means a very different division of labor between the United States and its European friends. Second, a much more rapid military disengagement from the Middle East and a broader diplomatic engagement with everyone there. At this point, there's no Middle Eastern country that deserves unconditional American support, and the United States should be talking to everyone there the way that Russia and China do. And last but not least, we're going to have to do more with others to prevent China from becoming the dominant power in Asia. But we don't want to turn that into a crusade to overturn the Chinese Communist Party or try to transform China into some kind of liberal democracy. An ideological crusade of that sort will make it, I think, impossible to cooperate with China on the many issues where our interests do, in fact, overlap. So as Jake said, we're going to have to find a balance here between the measures we need to do to keep China in Asia without allowing that to so poison our relationship that we can't deal with each other effectively on other issues. Now, what I've just sketched is clearly very different than the Trump administration's bumbling. I think it's somewhat different than what we can expect to see from a Biden administration, although Michèle and Jake may have insights on that question. But as I said at the very beginning, I think the most important thing is to use this as an opportunity to stop living in the past, get past some of the old ideas that have driven American foreign policy, and think broadly and creatively about the role the United States should be playing in the years to come. Thanks.
Steve, thanks. And the three of you have, I think, set this up nicely for my first question. And it's this. It's a mind-boggling environment, both at home and abroad. And I would quote something that FDR said about Lincoln, one undeniably great president to another. FDR said that Lincoln died a sad man because he couldn't have everything. And we're talking about a president who in 8 years probably demonstrated a second American Revolution, set the country on a course which over time made it fundamentally better, even though it's still a work in progress. Governing is about choosing. And listening to the three of you, I mean, I worked on one issue for 20 plus years, and that one issue lies in seeming wreckage today. And that's one issue inside of government. And it's hard, as two of the three of you know, to get anything done. So Jake has identified his three priorities, but if you had to write your memo to the next president, what is really essential for the United States to begin this process of repairing its competence, its credibility, and protecting its interests? Jake identified clearly foreign policy begins at home with a resilient American, economically, socially. What are your three priorities? Michèle, can I go to you first?
Sure. So I would foot stomp Jake's first one, which is we have to rebuild our domestic foundations for a smart foreign policy and effective foreign policy. I would just unpack this notion of investing in the drivers of American competitiveness, what that actually means. It means putting more resources and incentivizing private sector spending on science and technology, research and development, 21st century infrastructure. Why in the world is the United States not the leader in 5G? I mean, it's crazy. Smart immigration policy that attracts the best and brightest from around the world and tries to get them to stay and actually build their enterprises here. Better access to higher education, healthcare, and so forth. So, you know, our economic foundation, our ability to compete economically, technologically, is absolutely paramount as the foundation. In terms of the security domain, I think we have to go back to basics. And at a time, as you know, Steve and Jake both noted, there is this narrative of U.S. decline. There is a narrative that we're internally, a mess and preoccupied. And that's a very dangerous narrative because it invites our competitors and our adversaries to start making mischief and to say, well, maybe they're distracted, maybe they don't have the resolve or the capability to respond. So we're gonna make mischief here. We're gonna test the boundaries with coercion or aggression. So for me, it means on the security side, we've got to really double down on shoring up deterrence, and being very clear-eyed about what that really means, and requires, and reinvesting in our alliances in a way that does ask our allies to step up and do more and partner with us, to sort of safeguard stability. Because the last thing we need, at this time where we do need to do a lot of domestic rebuilding, is to have, Iran or North Korea or Russia or China through miscalculation decide that now is a good time to launch an act of aggression that really does touch our important or vital interests and does require a response. So I think the last thing I'll say is, I've done a lot of work on defense strategy. The easy part is saying what your priorities are. The hard part is saying what you're not going to do or what you're going to do less of. Where are you going to accept and manage a degree of risk? And I think that's the hardest part of the exercise we're going to have to go through in the future.
Thanks, Michelle. Steve, your 3 vital interests that deserve immediate attention?
Yeah, I'll focus on foreign policy stuff because I don't claim to know how to reform the American domestic political system at all. I mean, I would reverse the order that Jake used and say that I think the most critical relationship will be managing the relationship with China. That if we get that more or less right, then lots of other things become easier. If we get that wrong, lots of other things become much harder. And as I said earlier, I think that both involves doing much more with others in Asia to contain Chinese influence while making sure this doesn't turn into some kind of ideological crusade, which will poison any possibility of cooperation. And it seems to me is likely to alarm others in Asia who get very nervous whenever we're perceived as raising the temperature unnecessarily. Asia is, it seems to me, the place where American alliance leadership is most appropriate and most badly needed. There's clearly lots of concern about what China's rising power means, ranging from India on one side all the way around to Japan at the other end and many countries in between. But coordinating that group of countries, coordinating that coalition is not easy to do. The distances are vast. There are real trade-offs between their security concerns and their economic ties to China. And some of those countries, such as South Korea and Japan, have a fairly troubled relationship themselves. This is a sort of ideal place for the United States to exert some alliance leadership. But what that requires, of course, is lots of time, lots of attention, and lots of skilled and knowledgeable diplomats to do that for us, which leads me to my second priority, which again has already been mentioned. We have to rebuild the institutional capacity of the U.S. government to do a competent foreign policy, as much on the diplomatic side as on the military side. I think that process of deterioration has been underway for some time. It was significantly accelerated under the Trump administration. And it's not something that you can, to flip a switch, pass a bill, and get it back instantaneously. But rebuilding that diplomatic capacity, it seems to me, would be the second priority. And then finally, I do think as part of this greater level of diplomatic engagement, there are a number of big global issues that are going to have to be addressed. We've already talked about climate change to some degree. That's obvious. More effective measures to deal with future pandemics, and there will be future pandemics, are obviously necessary. And finally, as I said, there is this backlash against globalization, but we want to maintain a relatively open world where trade and investment can still occur without causing some of the backlash that we've seen in the past. And that means, in some respects, restructuring the international trade and financial order away from sort of hyper-globalization and to something that still encourages, the productive use of resources around the world, but allows countries a little bit more freedom to tailor it to their own domestic concerns and cultural values, and doesn't have the destabilizing consequences we've seen in the United States and some other places as well. So those would be my 3.
Thanks, Steve. You've all talked about China, and clearly the pandemic has not led to more sharing, more cooperation, more multilateral, functional efforts to deal with the virus. So if you were to offer your 3 ABCs when it comes to a how-to on China, what would they be? And one other asterisk on this one. We're great at defining our own national interests. We're much less prepared, it seems to me, to accept the fact that other countries, even in adversarial relationships with the United States, also have interests that are quite legitimate. And I guess that's my question with respect to China. How do we deal with China and through a lens that basically recognizes what their legitimate national interests are and also protects our own? Jake, can I start with you?
Sure. I think my ABC, God, you ask hard questions. I have an ABC through probably like H or I, but I'll limit myself to ABC, and for the bonus episode we can do the rest of it.
Right.
So the first is, China presents a real quandary for what Steve was just talking about in terms of thinking about the trade and investment global order going forward. Because what you basically have is a non-market economy, a state capitalist system that puts a huge amount of emphasis on state-owned enterprises and state subsidies to drive forward its national champions. And to kind of surf along a more open trading and economic system that the rest of the world is participating in. So the first thing is to figure out how to make adjustments to the rules in concert with our allies and partners that takes account of the fact that China is a fundamentally different actor when it comes to international trade and economics. And for me, I think that means putting less emphasis on trying to change China's internal economic system and more emphasis on saying, okay, if that's the system that we're confronted with, how do you change the rules around it so that the playing field is more level and the global system is more fair? That's number one. Number two, I think we should put less focus on trying to slow China down and more emphasis on running faster ourselves, which comes back to the points that Michèle was making earlier. And so an effective China strategy starts with all of those investments at home. And then number three, I think we have to recognize that a cooperation with China on issues that matter to us is not doing a favor to China, and that we don't have to ease off of competition in key domains in order to try to secure their cooperation on things like climate or global health and so forth. It's fundamentally in their interest too. So I think we should think about this less in terms of trade-off and more in terms of a comprehensive strategy in which we are at once competing in certain areas and on the other hand, working with Beijing when it's in our national interest to do so. So getting that kind of dynamic right, thinking through how to structure the relationship between competition and cooperation would be the third in my ABC.
Jake, thanks so much. Very economical and focused. Michèle, I'm going to give you your article in Foreign Affairs a plug. Appeared this morning, How to Prevent a War in Asia. The Erosion of American Deterrence Raises the Risk of Chinese Miscalculation. So over to you on this ABC.
Yeah, so no, I absolutely agree with Jake's first point. And I would just, on this question of avoiding miscalculation, I start from the premise that neither the United States or China would want to be in a war with each other, given how devastating it would be and the risks of nuclear escalation and all the rest. So the only way this is going to happen, in my view, is if one of us miscalculates. And I think that if you assess both China's view of our resolve and our commitment to the region and our capability to defend our interests and allies in the region, we're on a bad trajectory where they are feeling more confident and they see us as in decline, less committed, less capable. And it's true that because we've been so focused on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, optimizing forces for counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, we have not necessarily made the kinds of investments we're going to need to underwrite deterrence in any kind of way with China, be it in the gray zone or actually crossing the line into conflict. And so what I tried to do in the article is to say, we really have to refine our objectives to focus on deterrence, but also really be very targeted in our investments to keep the technological edge. Right now, the Department of Defense is overinvested in legacy systems and underinvested in accelerating key technologies that will be critical to keeping the forces we will have survivable, relevant, and combat effective for the future. The last thing I want to say is just that competing with China, deterring China, does not mean we stop talking to them. It's really, really important to have a strategic dialogue, first and foremost in the areas where we absolutely need to cooperate to be effective, whether it's dealing with climate change or North Korea, and we can go down the list, but also to really correct misperceptions. I know we're short on time, but if you get into Chinese military doctrine and how they would try to keep us from projecting our power forward, some of the things that they would do, cyber and space attacks, are almost certainly going to backfire. Cyber attacks on electrical infrastructure around U.S. military bases to prevent power projection are going to take down the same electricity grids that hospitals, public safety, other things depend on. They're going to kill civilians, and that's actually going to increase the likelihood of a very strong U.S. response that could escalate into open conflict. So we need a dialogue with China to try to take certain stupid ideas off the table with them, right? And we're not, and this is the first administration since President Nixon that has no strategic dialogue with China beyond tactical trade discussions. So let me stop there.
Michèle, thanks. Steve, do you want to add a brief thought? Because I want to go to a question or two from our audience.
Yeah, just you started by asking us sort of to think about what Chinese interests are. I mean, there's a tendency, I think, in the United States to think of China as Chinese nationalism as being something that is artificial and ginned up by the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's incorrect. It's like our nationalism. It's sincere, it's heartfelt. And remember, from a Chinese perspective, the world's most powerful country is still the United States, and the world's most powerful country has alliances all around China, has military forces near China, and China doesn't have anything similar in the Western Hemisphere. So from their perspective, we are still, in some respects, the dominant power, and that worries them. Second thing to remember about the Chinese is that they worry greatly about domestic stability at home and the need to maintain a certain degree of economic growth for their population. And I think that's a major priority. And it's why I suggest that if we imply that some form of regime change, even if well down the road, is our long-term objective, this is going to be anathema to the Chinese Communist Party and get in the way of any kind of constructive relationship on other issues. Final point is that I often think about the politics of our alliances in Asia as one where the real problem is which superpower or which great power is disturbing the peace, right? If countries in Asia believe China is primarily the country that's disturbing the peace, building islands in the South China Sea, provoking a confrontation with India along their border, then they are naturally inclined to want to be closer to the United States and to distance themselves from China. If, on the other hand, the United States is seen as the country that is disturbing the peace, promising fire and fury on the Korean Peninsula or things like that, that makes countries in Asia, even our friends in Asia, nervous. So a major challenge for us is reassuring friends in Asia, but not being so confrontational towards China that we're seen as the one that's actually causing trouble there. That's going to make actually our alliances less effective at doing what we want.
Thanks. Okay, so we have a couple intriguing questions. The first from former Senator from Colorado, Tim Wirth. He asks via email the following, quote, have you examined the numerous emergency powers held by the president on or about the time of the November election? Might he be able to create an international crisis, parens, e.g. the Gulf of Tonkin, close parens, and declare a national emergency sufficient to shut down elections or counting, all leading to an effective coup by the president? And none of us can see around corners clearly, but would one or two of you offer a brief comment on that question? I know it's somewhat fraught.
I'll take a swing at it. I think you can't underestimate the level to which this administration may go to try and win this election in a variety of ways, whether it's voter suppression, deep fake news videos, or things like that. I don't think, however, provoking some kind of international crisis as an excuse to then impose martial law or suspend the elections is going to work. After all, if the current pandemic is not enough of a crisis to do this, you certainly don't need a Gulf of Tonkin incident as your pretext. And my guess is it would be seen as a transparent effort to suspend the Constitution and remain in power illegally and would backfire badly. I hope I'm right.
Yeah, crises and wars have rarely successfully contributed to aggrandizing the power of the presidency or its capacity to project that power. Certainly in the 20th century. Another question from Ishan Tharoor, foreign affairs columnist at the Post. Ishan asks the following: I'd like the distinguished panel to weigh in on the revelations from John Bolton's book. Beyond what it exposes about Trump's own transactional political style and proclivity to strongmen, does it undermine the GOP's broader hawkish approach to China? In a post-Trump world, what is the correct posture vis-a-vis Beijing? I think we've addressed that one. Would anyone like to offer a comment on what the Bolton book says? What is the main takeaway from John Bolton's book? If not, it's quite okay. I worked for Republicans and Democrats, and I voted for them too. So
there's nothing surprising in it. There's nothing surprising in it. John Bolton, at least based on the news accounts, because I don't think any of us have read it yet. The fact is, John Bolton had a reputation for being a very sharp-elbowed colleague, and that comes across in the book. And nothing about his account of the president is substantially different from the way that other former members of the Trump administration have described the president. So lots more detail, but not a new picture.
Fair enough.
I would just say on this, Aaron, one thing. I basically agree with Steve. It gives more color and anecdote to what we already know about a person whose temperament, judgment, and approach to foreign policy has not served the national interest. In fact, it's, Donald Trump has basically thought about every decision he's taken as what's in his own personal interest, even at the expense of the national interest. But one thing that did strike me and disturb me about what Bolton relayed was this notion that President Trump was actually sort of encouraging Xi Jinping to carry on the industrial scale acts of repression and brutality against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. That even for Trump felt fairly extreme. And then the other thing that struck me this week was a piece in Bloomberg by Peter Martin that basically said, look, the Chinese government is coming to the point where they want 4 more years. And everything you read of Trump, they think that's in their interest. And everything you read and what Bolton says kind of gives you a sense of why it would be that the Chinese government would want that. So those were some of my reflections on what I saw in the excerpt from his book.
Well, your comment, Jake's a good transition into a question I wanted to ask the three of you, and that is the role of, importance of, centrality of values, human rights, promotion of political participation, gender equality, any number of, issues in American foreign policy. The late John McCain, and I argued with him about this, but I admired him, basically believed that American interests are our values and vice versa. Now that tethers U.S. policy to a set of choices, which really doesn't afford a whole lot of flexibility. So I've grappled with it for years, how we essentially deal with this whole issue. I mean, we talk about efforts to, stop mass genocide and mass killing, and yet the record on U.S. policy here is very bad, from the Nazi Holocaust to Cambodia to Rwanda to Darfur to Congo to Syria. Bosnia and Kosovo may actually have been the exception. So we have this image of ourselves as the protector, and yet more often than not only don't we protect, but we root a policy in the realities, quote unquote, of what it takes to get along with undesirable figures. So let's just take one case. I'm interested in how you'd respond. The case of the young 30-something-year-old Mohammed bin Salman, a man who has brought, not arguably, great reforms to Saudi Arabia, but the expense of tremendous repression, serial incompetence abroad, whether it's Yemen, Qatar, the virtual hostage video with the Lebanese prime minister. How would another administration deal with the reality of MBS and the reality that the Saudis, we do share some interests with Saudi Arabia? How do you deal with that?
I guess I don't want to speak for some future administration, but I have been in many discussions where we've wrestled with some version of this issue. And I don't think it's necessarily a tension between our interests and our values. It's that we often have interests that compete with each other or pull us in different directions. I think we're at a moment where, because of this administration, people are questioning whether we have any values, whether we stand for anything anymore, whether America is true to its own values at home or abroad. So I do think going forward, we're going to have to make sure to place significant emphasis on being true to our values in our foreign policy and in our pursuit of our interests. But in the specific case of Saudi Arabia, it is a challenging situation, because on the one hand, we are no longer as dependent on energy from the region, and that's a great thing. But we do care about, the world energy markets, and the free flow of resources from the region still matters to us economically. We want to support the kind of liberalization and reform efforts that are happening in Saudi Arabia, but we don't want to sanction the terrible actions, whether it's killing of Khashoggi or the horrible war in Yemen and its damage to the incredible civilian harm that's been done. And so I think it's a question. I don't think completely breaking ties with Saudi Arabia and or trying to hope for regime change that we're going to get something better, which I think is really unlikely. I think you have to figure out, how do you stay engaged, and how do you use your engagement to press for more accountability and for a change of behavior, and to use levers, whether it's our security assistance saying, no, we won't supply you with offensive weapons that you can use in Yemen, but I think our biggest leverage is actually private sector. I mean, MBS's actions have created a conversation in every boardroom of every U.S. company that has done business in Saudi Arabia to ask the question, is this too great a net reputational risk? Do we need to pull out? And if all of U.S. business pulls out, that will be a huge blow to the reform agenda that he's trying to use as the defining element of his program. So this is complicated stuff, but I absolutely believe that we can't just check our values at the door. Our values have to be at the table as we're weighing our interests as well.
The Saudis are going to hold the G20 in November, if I'm not mistaken, which will be, I'm not sure the corporate world is listening, though, Michelle. That's my concern. Money and oil are driving forces, and they're crowding out, it seems to me.
I can tell you that I've been inside a number of discussions, either in the boardroom or advising companies that are making different decisions because of the reputational risk. Some may, like energy, can't necessarily pull out, but others can.
That's good to hear. Would anyone, I have one additional question from a caller, but would anybody like to offer a thought on the rights and interests issue? I know, Stephen, you've written a lot about this.
Well, as a sort of token realist here, I'm not supposed to care about values, but that's not really the case. I mean, I think there's a big difference between recognizing there are sometimes trade-offs between security interests and values, and we have to wrestle with that, and being essentially indifferent to them, as I think the Trump administration has been, except for some very rare exceptions. The case you put in front of it, though, I think in front of us is actually one of the simpler ones, where the United States could have been much tougher on Saudi Arabia than we were, in particular over their behavior in Yemen, but also the Khashoggi thing, without completely abandoning our support for the reform movement. Remember, the reform movement, to the extent that it is occurring in Saudi Arabia, is something they're doing not as a favor to us, but because they think that's essential to their long-term future. That process is going to continue even if the United States, for example, stops sending them weaponry that they can use to further destroy Yemen. So this was a case, it seems to me, where we should have, in fact, allowed our values to speak much more loudly than they did. And the security consequences, the security trade-offs would have been relatively modest. And I take Michèle's point entirely. The American business community is actually something that is a way of advancing interests in a variety of different ways, because they are very sensitive to reputation and market issues. And that's something where, again, leadership at the presidential and State Department level can nudge companies, or at least let them see issues in particular ways that are likely to produce the kind of long-term evolution that we'd like to see.
Aaron, just zooming out a little bit from the specific Saudi case. And I agree, by the way, both with Michèle and Steve in their analysis. I do think we had tools and leverage to react more emphatically with respect to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And I also believe that we should be absolutely removing all forms of support for the continuing hostilities in Yemen. But I think there's a larger issue in your question. And my answer to it is quite direct, which is I believe that values do have to be central to the future of US foreign policy. And that is especially true in a moment, as Michèle said in her opening comments, when there is deep contestation by a set of powerful actors in the world that are pressing up against the kind of democratic free world in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, are trying to undermine and destabilize and discredit democracy. That the future of US foreign policy lies to a certain extent in shoring up the foundations of democracy at home, first and foremost, but also of fellow democracies. And that has to be a critical part of our foreign policy as we think ahead. And we should not be agnostic about our support for fellow democracies, fellow strong democracies, nor, as the Trump administration has done, should we be beyond agnostic, sort of positive towards strongmen as somehow a more credible or effective way of governing. And I think a sharp turn from the way the Trump administration has approached this issue is very much in order.
Thanks, Jake. Well, one final question from Kevin Barron, and I think it's got to be directed at Michèle and Jake. Kevin's the editor-in-chief of Defense One. He asks via email, quote, if Trump loses re-election, will a Biden administration rebuild the non-military tools of foreign policy? Would Biden propose serious spending increases for state USAID? And would that mean big cuts to defense spending to pay for this? Both of you have touched tangentially on the institutional requirements of building up diplomacy, Department of State. Would you like to add anything to that, either of you?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I can't speak for the campaign or a Biden administration, but I think that you're likely to see a broader definition of national security, what counts as national security, including things like pandemic prevention and climate change and so forth. It means national threats that we've been talking about. But I also think, a rebuild, I think it's widely recognized that the national security toolkit needs rebuilding. We've, the diplomatic corps, the intelligence community, the civilians side of the Pentagon. I mean, there's been development assistance, there's been real damage, and as Steve said, and Jake too, real rebuilding that has to happen. The good news is that these instruments are a real bargain compared to what we invest in the military. It doesn't take $700 billion to rebuild a healthy State Department or USAID or the relevant parts of Treasury in terms of their international outreach. So it's something that we can do. We can do it affordably if we spend money appropriately. Will there be trade-offs with defense? I think yes, but I think that will be driven more by the state of our economy and the need for the domestic investment. But one thing you learn about defense is appetite is always greater than resources, and it's not about throwing money at the problem. It's about being really strategic and really smart about how you spend the money. And I think that the department can meet the objective of keeping its edge, showing up deterrence, supporting a revised, smarter national security strategy, and do it with less resources than it's had in the recent past. And that's true whether it's a second Trump term, God help us, or a Biden term. This is happening. I mean, defense spending will be flattened or declining to some extent, no matter who's president, because of the situation we're in here at home.
Right. All right. It is noon, but I have one additional question, which would only require a one-line answer from each of you. And it's one I've been thinking about for a long time. I haven't given up hope in America's capacity to play a consequential role abroad, but my years at working in government and what I've seen for the last 20 have forced me to give up most of my illusions. The U.S., and at least in the Middle East, is like a modern-day Gulliver, wandering around tied up by tiny and large powers whose interests are often not their own and tied up at their own illusions. So here's my question. What is the one illusion, not just in the Middle East, globally, what's the one illusion that the U.S. needs to give up? In one sentence, and then we'll close. Steve, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Yeah.
One illusion that needs to go.
The illusion that if the United States isn't managing local politics in almost every corner of the world, then disaster beckons. We have assumed that if we retrenched at all, if we let some parts of the world handle their own affairs, that after that, le deluge. And that, I think, is probably a mistake. We cause a lot of trouble in lots of places with the best of intentions, and we ought to recognize that we may not be indispensable. The world actually might be better off, and we might be better off with a slightly more refined image of our own role. That's more than one sentence, but that's it.
Thank you. Jake.
Boy, that's a real stumper, because the reason it's a stumper is because when you say the U.S. has to give up an illusion, it feels like there's so many different kind of constituencies in the United States who have different views about different things. I guess I would go back to the state of the international trading and economic system and say that the just continuing march towards liberalization necessarily is going to redound to the overall national economic interest of each country. I think we need to adjust our thinking on that, not to go back to mercantilism or autarky or anything like it, but I think we have to have a fundamental rethink of what the rules of the road have to look like in trade, tax policy, corruption policy, climate policy, and global finance policy. That the basic momentum that was built up over decades, and we kind of continue on inertia. I think we're at a moment where a profound rethink is required.
Thanks, Jake. And Michèle, the final word.
Oh dear. I think the illusion that we can dictate terms to other countries and achieve all our goals by ourselves if we're just strong enough and tough enough. You know, the illusion of unilateral American power as being, you know, sufficient to address the kind of challenges we've been talking about throughout this conversation. It's not. And the only way we're going to succeed is to be smarter about the goals we set and smarter about how we engage and build coalitions of like-minded states.
Thanks, Michèle. I mean, I must say, this has been an incredibly rich conversation. I'm glad I didn't have to answer these questions. Tremendous authority, expertise, balance, and the kind of perspective that characterizes individuals who have thought long and hard about these issues over a great many years. So I want to thank Steve, Jake, and Michèle. And to our callers, at one time 600 plus on this call, if you enjoyed tuning into today's show, please be sure to like the video and to subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date on the latest content from me and my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I guess until next time, which will be soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.
You stay well.
Thanks a lot.
You too.